Good morning. Our chalice lighting today comes from Reverend Lisa Ward, and I share those words with you now. Our chalice flame symbolizes our life together, the light our covenant gives us in our life together. For within our covenant is the acceptance of one another and the celebration of one another and of life, with all of its challenges, pain, losses, ironies, and joys. May it be so. And now, Mignon. The Unitarians and the Universalists came together in a merger around 1961. The Universalists, for more than a century, had advocated the utterly outrageous idea that nobody was going to hell. And they were ostracized for that particular belief, but they were firmly within the Protestant fold of American religion, but they believed that the God they believed in was so great in love that no one ultimately could be shut outside of that love. And this message did not receive a very large audience in 1940s and 1930s and 40s and 50s America. They dwindled in size, and someone with the Unitarian denomination said, well, you are somewhat akin to us, let us join forces. And subsequent to that marriage, the Unitarians inherited a great many wonderful old cathedrals all over New England and this country. But when they formed a union out of necessity, in a way, the world and the culture and the society of America was very different than it is today. There was an enormous amount of consensus, at least at one level, about basic values and the understanding of the world. And the Protestant world was big and robust and powerful, as was its Catholic alternative, as was, of course, the Jewish faith and other groups. But there was a sense of solidarity coming out of World War II, and subsequently for the decades after that, a tendency towards consensus, towards agreement. And the Unitarian Universalist movement was an alternative in some ways to that. They were free thinkers, people who said, oh, I don't think I will join the consensus. I think I see cracks in their story, and no, I will follow my own path. The consensus that was behind the solidity of Protestantism and the Catholic tradition and other religious traditions began to dissolve in 1965. And it has been dissolving ever since, up until this moment. So that right now, our country is polarized and fragmented in many ways. And the posture that we have to our culture right now is very different than that we had 40 or 50 years ago. And the way in which we understand ourselves and our place in our society, I think, must change as well if we are to survive as a religious movement. Also, Our country, our society has become much more secular. And as someone who's lived in California, you can feel this much more strongly in California than you can here, but the trends are clear. Protestantism in particular is just dying out at an unbelievable rate. But at the same time, the human need for connection, the human need for solace and strength in the face of adversity, the human need to grapple with the reality of our finitude, the reality of our losses, the need to be inspired, the need to come together with others to form important bonds that we can together lock arms and fight justice, fight against injustice, and struggle against our ecological problems and so forth. That has not died away. That is part of the human condition. And so we have right now, as a religious movement, if we are willing to adjust our attitude to the realities of the moment, we have an opportunity to find a very important role in our society as it is today. The young people of today have a skepticism about traditional religion, about different ways of traditional thought that is hugely different than the same generation 40 or 50 years ago. And yet our congregations were born in that ideology of what life was like in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. UUs have something important to say to society. The Unitarian movement began at a time in our society, long ago, I'm talking about the 1830s, 1840s, when the idea about humanity prevalent in all the religions was that human beings were hopelessly mired in their own selfish beliefs, that they were corrupted and corrupting, that there was no way for human beings to have hope in the world and to have a future unless it was by divine intervention. And the Unitarians, from the very beginning, and I'm thinking about William Ellery Channing and others who began the Unitarian movement, said, you know what? Human beings have an infinite capacity for good. Human beings have an infinite capacity for progress, for making life and society better. And people who were inspired by these ideas in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s created a whole range of institutions and projects to address the social problems of their time. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Unitarians had an insight. And that insight was there is a core of goodness in human beings, all human beings. And we can build on that, and we can cultivate that, like cultivating a garden, but this is an inner garden. And we can develop a society where life is better. And we mustn't let go of this intrinsic goodness that is in the human being. And that was the Unitarian insight that's still with us today. Yes, as we look around the world, as we observe human behavior, we can be drawn towards pessimism and hopelessness. Those things can be justified intellectually. And many examples can be cited in support of pessimism and hopelessness. But to embrace those viewpoints about human nature or ourselves or our future dooms the possibility of real progress in the world. Furthermore, the problem of human beings devaluing themselves, of not affirming themselves, is in itself a disease that disables us in many ways. There are strengths of the human being, they said, and we should seize and capitalize upon them. And one of them is our capacity for community. Human beings would not have survived the long journey of evolution if we, as a species, did not have a vast capacity for community and building bonds. Some anthropologists refer to this as our capacity for hyper-cooperation, which is, and I quote, posited as contributing to the emergence of human culture. Anthropologists have noted some of our defining traits as human as the following. Could I have the first slide? Shared intentionality, the capacity for shared intentionality, involving the capacity to engage with others in shared goals and intention. The skill is absent in our cousins, our evolutionary cousins, and involves understanding others and increased ability to communicate cooperatively our intentions and be cooperative in the pursuit of our goals. Shared intentionality also includes the capacity for social and instructed learning. You can take that slide down now. So the point anthropologists are making is that our humanity is defined, our specialness as a species is defined by the ways in which we can create and maintain community. Human beings desire very deeply connection to others in a calm and mutually respectful environment. This issue is particularly important right now because we face a society right now that is permeated with polarization. Thomas Edsel, who writes regularly columns for the New York Times, wrote this. You can put up the next slide, on December the 15th of last year. He talks about the level of suspicion and distrust in our society and the anxiety caused by that. And he writes, this level of anxiety is in itself dangerous, all the more so when it masks the true aim of America's contemporary right-wing movement, which is the restoration and the preservation of white control of the culture. It is not beyond imagination that various political groups could be prepared for and fueled by a mixture of fear and provocation, push the nation over the brink. Next slide, please. Jimmy Carter, beginning the year, January the 5th, the South's own wonderful son, one of our presidents, wrote in the New York Times, our great nation now teeters on the brink of a widening abyss. Without immediate action, we are at genuine risk of civil conflict and losing our precious democracy. We must set aside differences and work together before it is too late. You can take that down. The point is, Jimmy Carter, in his aged condition, comes out of retirement to make a statement like this. I lived in Canada for a while, and it was fascinating to me to experience life there and the difference there. But one of the things that was most fascinating to me was that they saw America and Americans in a way that was different than Americans see themselves. That even though they're very close physically, they had a different perspective. And a man named Thomas Homer Dixon, who has studied and published articles for 4 decades on war, social breakdown, revolution, and ethnic violence, wrote in the Canadian paper the Globe and the Mail, an outstanding paper rooted in Toronto. He wrote the following: by 2025, American democracy could collapse, causing extreme domestic political instability, including widespread civil violence. By 2030, if not sooner, the country could be governed by a right-wing dictatorship. You can take that one down. Then he goes on to explain what he saw as the reasons for this. He said, oh, by the way, these tensions that we see in America didn't just suddenly come out of a vacuum. And he goes on to recount the story of when he was a student in the 1980s in this country. And from time to time, he would listen to a now deceased announcer, a broadcaster, radio personality called Rush Limbaugh. And Rush Limbaugh lived on the fuel and the energy generated by creating polarizations. And I lived in Florida when he was in his heyday, or in his early heyday, and it just amazed me that someone like that, who was creating divisiveness every day, was allowed to stay on the air. And of course, he found out that, Limbaugh found out that it can be very lucrative to do what he was doing. But as we know today, we have had a steady growth in commentators, political commentators, who's fallen in the footsteps of Limbaugh, and their whole their whole approach is to create divisiveness. And so we are now reaping the whirlwind of that divisive speech that has gone on for decades, unchallenged. Well, it is very evident as you consider these different realities that Unitarian Universalists have a role to play. I would like to encourage the idea more and more that Unitarian Universalism is not simply a group of people who have this wonderful resource for friends and activities and excitements that they can enjoy, but the Unitarian Universalist movement is something that provides a light for our culture and our society. We are an institution that brings something very important to our society, and it's right here in our midst. And one of those things is a covenant. The act of having a covenant, of practicing a covenant, which is a live document, never closed, always open to revision, is not just something that is good for the congregation, but it is a beacon and a light for our society. Because by doing it, by making a covenant and living by a covenant, we're saying to the world, we can come together as a group of people based on our principles and values, and conclude that we will conduct ourselves with one another in how we speak and in how we act, that will give us a community that addresses and fulfills our deepest needs. And we can do that together. And we can embrace diversity, and we can live with diversity and difference of opinion, and we can absorb that into a community that gives us vibrancy. And that is a real gift to give to society. Covenants foster circles of trust. Circles of trust are the essence of human living. Those circles of trust help people enter into a larger community of shared intentions, hopes, and goals. And that process itself, the whole thing, allows important and meaningful work to be done among our people, in the community, and beyond. I wish to emphasize, again, that this work we do is important not just for us, but for our society. I hope all of us can engage with the Committee on Ministry in the work that they are doing, and I look forward to hearing more about that after the service. Our meditation reading is from Reverend Lisa Ward, again, who writes, "A covenant is not a definition of a relationship. It is the framework for our relating. A covenant claims, I will abide with you in this common endeavor, be present as best I can be in our coming and becoming. A covenant is a dance of co-creation, keeping in step with one another in the flow of our lives. A covenant seeks harmony and a shared voice. A covenant gives authority to shared intention. A covenant invites and embraces relationship. A covenant relies upon the treasures of shared truth. Truth is an ever-changing thing in our seeking to understand one another in the world because of our limited perspectives. We grow into a deeper sense of the meaning of things when we take our journeys together, sharing them with a full heart and mind. The courage within our covenant is the acceptance and celebration of life and all its pain, sorrows, and joys. The sacrifice within the covenant is in letting go of dogma, assumptions of control, and giving over to a greater wisdom which might come to us in bits and pieces. The task of our covenant is to take responsibility for the freedom we espouse. We know that we are interconnected and that what we do creates ripples of hope or despair, of affirmation or negation. What we do with and for one another is powerful beyond our imagining. And now Mignon. Our words for extinguishing the chalice also come from Reverend Lisa Ward, who writes, within our covenant is the truth, with a capital T, of our life together. Something which no one person can see the whole of, yet something which each and every person can come to know in glimpses, in pieces of one another's stories, in gestures of kindness, in words of empathy, in epiphanies. Amen.